Okay, last time we spoke about some of the basic rules of what the Techum is and how you establish the size of a Techum, and also about the items that you have, both things about setting up a Techum on a more basic level. We didn't have time to do this part, which is what happens when someone walks out of the Techum. So they have the Techum. We figured out last time what your person's Techum is, and now the person's out of the Techum. So I'm going to talk about three different scenarios, all of which are based on real life stories. It's not exactly how they happened, but give or take, just for the point of it. Excuse me. And the third one, of which actually is particular for hashgachas, but I guess all three could potentially be relevant also. Okay, the first is like this: a person was on a flight, and the flight was delayed, and it landed just as Shabbos was starting. So the person gets off the plane, and goes into the airport terminal, and that's when Shabbos starts. So the assumption is that the airport terminal is going to be his place. His makom shvitz will be in the airport terminal, and in most cases, airports are in pretty remote areas, and once there won't be any houses near or places that count as houses anywhere near the airport's buildings, which means is his home will be his makom shvitz somewhere, give or take the airport. In that general area, and then he won't be able to walk home because his house is going to be out of the Techum. But we assume the assumption will be is that he could have the whole airport terminal. It's an enclosed building. We saw last time that an enclosed building counts as one place. You have dalat amas, or you have a place where your place would be that whole building, and he'd stay there. Maybe if it's possible that there's a hotel in the airport or right near that's within the Techum of the airport, which is not unreasonable, especially because the terminal is pretty big, and he could. So the hotel might be not far from that. So maybe he can get himself into a hotel for Shabbos. That would be the assumption. Now, the truth is, what I just said is not so obvious, and that's because I mentioned last time that in order to count as when we say an enclosed area is your dalaramas. The enclosed area is your dalat amas. That's your place. That's the place where you are. It's a little more complicated than that. Said it last time. I said it has to be a habitable living space. So let's just talk about that a bit and see if an airport terminal qualifies. So first, is just for some background. Shulchan Aruch says not in Techum, not in Techum. It says is that there's something called a beis hasayim, a space that would hold 2 sa'ah, and that's equivalent to 5,000 square amas, and that is it's connected to where we get the idea of 70 amas, 70 and 2/3 amas comes from this, because it's a box that would be 70 and 2/3 amas by 70 and 2/3 amas would be 5,000 square amas. Anyhow, so it's about 5,000 square amas. So it's 100 amas by 50 amas is 5,000 square amas. And in for our purposes, just help us understand that it's a little bit under 16,000 feet, 16,000 square feet. Okay, now that 16,000 square feet is much larger than a regular house. I mean, like an average house is give or take 2,500 square feet, so it's way bigger than an average house, but it's much smaller than even the smallest airport terminal. Some of you may know there's a terminal, there's an airport in Trenton, New Jersey. They're talking about expanding it, but the existing current small terminal that they have, that's a small airport terminal, or it's 25,000 square feet. So it's bigger than a beis hasayim. And the Terminal A, in Newark Airport, they built the new Terminal A. It has approximately 1 million square feet. Okay, so an airport terminal is going to be, every airport terminal that we can imagine is way bigger than a beis hasayim. Now, the Shulchan Aruch says about Techum that when we say that an area that's surrounded by walls is considered one house, that's your spot, that's only true if it's either smaller than a beis hasayim, like your house, or if it was specifically meant for people as a place where people could live, hukaf l'dira, has what I called last time a habitable living space. Now, it doesn't have to be people living in it, but it has to be meant for that. So, Shulchan Aruch says, also not in Hilchos Techum, but the Shulchan Aruch says to be hukaf l'dira, a structure has to be meant either for eating or sleeping, and of the two of those, actually, eating is more important than sleeping. Now, in an airport, terminal, there's no place designated for sleeping. People sleeping on benches doesn't count. There's no place meant for sleeping. But there are plenty of restaurants in the terminal. So does that mean that do those restaurants count to say this is a place meant for eating? So it's hukah fadira, and therefore we could say even though it's bigger than a base Sayim, it's considered hukah fadira, and it would count as a person's place. So Chazon Ish says like this. Chazon Ish says that if you have a factory, like a manufacturing facility, is not considered hukah fadira, even though the workers have a break room where they could eat their lunch. He says that doesn't count. That's not considered a place for eating. It's a factory. It's a place for making shoes. It has nothing. The eating is just like a side thing that people happen to do there. He says, but I'm not sure what happens if they had like a more serious dining room. Maybe the word break room is. I guess you could read it different ways. But if it's a more serious dining room, he said, I'm not sure whether that makes it considered hukah fadira that they eat lunch there. That's what he says in one place. But in the Hashmatas, at the end of the Sefer, he says that if there's a place that's if there's a room that's designated for eating, like in a more serious way, then that's for sure, that is considered a hukah fadira. For example, we could say, he doesn't say this example, say you have a yeshiva dining room or an employee cafeteria at a workplace. Okay, so that's a very different thing. There's a kitchen, they serve formal meals. That's a very different thing. And in that case, that would be considered, even the Chazon Ish would say that's considered hukah fadira. So you say, okay, well then restaurant, that's what restaurants are. They're a place with a kitchen where people sit down and they eat formal meals in those places. So we should say that it is hukah fadira. On the other hand, there's a big difference between an airport or a restaurant or a yeshiva kitchen. The yeshiva kitchen, the same people, or a workplace cafeteria, the same people eat there every single day. So we want to say that this is their place. This is this is a dira. We could say, fine, these people, they eat here, they eat lunch here every day, or they eat breakfast or lunch here every single day. As opposed to a restaurant, the whole idea of a restaurant is they serve different people every day. Okay, so that in itself makes it aray, not a hukah fadira, not a home kind of a place. It's sort of like there's a din in Hilchos Chumash called Yoshri Tzrifim, these are transient people, and their tents are not considered hukah fadira, because they're not considered hukah fadira. These people are very transient. So, okay, now in the case of the Yoshri Tzrifim, these tents, they're not such formal structures. The structure itself is not so formal. So that would be a reason to make it say that that's not a base dira, which of course not a restaurant. The restaurant is a serious structure, but the restaurant's business is very different in that it doesn't serve the same people every day. So it's a question. So, if that would be correct, that we say it's not hukah fadira because they serve different people every day, so then the person is not allowed to walk around the whole terminal. He'd get 2,000 amas from wherever he plopped down in the terminal. That's all he gets. He would not get the whole terminal, so I'm not sure about this question. Now, this whole thing the whole past few minutes that I just said, it's worth bearing in mind that Rabbi Yosef Jacobowitz, a person from Lakewood who has written Sfarim on Techum, he quotes Rav Shlomo Miller as saying that everything that I just told you, or a lot of what I just told you, is all based on the way the Chazon Ish understands of what it takes to be hukah fadira for Techum. But here, Rav Shlomo Miller says most of the poskim don't agree with the Chazon Ish, and they think is that hukah fadira doesn't have to be a place where you're designated for eating or designated for sleeping. It doesn't have to be designated for that thing. It just has to be a place where it's not usher to eat there, or it's not culturally inappropriate to eat in that place, like a shul. The Gemara's example is a shul. The shul is a place where you're not allowed to eat in that place, or other places where it's inappropriate to eat there. That's not hukah fadira. But any place where it's okay to eat, where it's acceptable to eat there, he has a raya from Borgenen, he says in case where it's okay to eat, then then it's considered hukah fadira, and according to which, of course, the airport terminal then is considered hukah fadira because, of course, you're allowed to eat there. And like the restaurants is the most obvious example, but people are eating there all the time, and you're allowed to. Okay, so now until now I talked to you about the person who landed just as Shabbos was starting. But what happens if he landed after Shabbos already started? Shabbos started at 6 o'clock and he landed at 8 o'clock, way after Shabbos had started. So there's a machlokes whether Techum applies to a person to people who are over 10 tefachim, that were Moshe's 35 inches off the ground, and of course that's where this person was when Shabbos started. He was over 10 tefachim. So for those who say that Techum does not apply above 10 tefachim, then when Shabbos started he had no place, and his place is wherever he was when he landed when Shabbos started. Okay, so what should we do? Should we say is there Techum or is there not Techum above 10 tefachim? So the Mechaber, Ramah together say like this: it's a unresolved question. We leave it hanging, and therefore what you should do is like this. Usually, it could be mekel. Excuse me, because tchumen are drabanan, so you could be mekel and assume there is no tchum above 10 tfachim. But if the person traveled more than 12 mil from where he was when Shabbos started, then that's a potential device. I'll explain in a second. Potential device, you have to be machmer to say that yes, he was his makom shvisa was in the place that was above 10 tvachim, and now he's out of his tchum. Okay, so 12 mil, 2,000 amas, which is a regular tchum, is 1 mil. So 12 mil is approximately, according to Moshe, is 8 miles. So when a person's on an airplane, I said Shabbos started at 6 and he landed at 8. He obviously went more than 12 mil from where he was when Shabbos started. So in Cain, we'd have to say is yes, we are concerned that there are tchumen above 10 tvachim. Where he was at 6 o'clock when Shabbos started, his makom shvisa was designated as being over there, wherever that spot was, where he was. Now he's gone out of his tchum. So now this is different than the person beforehand, because the person beforehand, Shabbos started, he was in the airport. That's why he just snuck in just as Shabbos was starting. Our person over here is a person who, by the time he landed, by the time he's on the ground, he's already out of his tchum. He's gone more than 12 mil. So his tchum was designated as the place where he was when Shabbos started, and now he's out of the tchum. Now, what happens to a person who's out of his tchum? What happens? He ended up out of his tchum. So the din is he can't move out of the place wherever he finds himself. Now that he's out of the tchum, wherever he finds himself, that's it. He can't move out of that spot. Now we talked about last time that a person's makom is more than actually. Technically, it's 4 amas, but really it's really much broader than 4 amas, as we saw last time. His place. So our person then he gets, assuming that we said beforehand that an airport terminal is considered to be a makom that's hukah for deer and it's a place, then he could walk around the whole airport terminal. Okay, that would be he's only allowed to walk Daled Amas, but his Daled Amas includes his whole airport terminal. Now he can't go to a hotel that's a few feet out of the airport terminal. He can't leave the airport terminal, but he could walk around. Assuming that the airport terminal is considered hukah for deer, he's allowed to walk out of the terminal. Just one little point, which is okay, how to get from the plane to the terminal. So there's actually an interesting thing about this. Doesn't know about a jet bridge, but essentially is if you make walls that connect the place where you are to the place where you want to be, that counts. In the case in the din is about people actually making the walls, but whatever that case is not relevant to us. But in our case, also the jet bridge that connects the plane to the terminal will allow him to walk. Again, all we consider like one place. He'll be allowed to walk from the plane into the terminal, and then once he's in the terminal, he has the whole terminal that's as if his makom shvisa, it's his not his makom shvisa, it's his Daled Amas, and to be allowed to walk there. Okay, so that was our first scenario, was a person whose flight landed late. Now, a similar case with a little bit different twist to it was there were a whole bus full of teenagers who were going to a bar mitzvah for Shabbos that was going to be taking place in some hotel. And there was a snowstorm, and they got very, very delayed. So as it was getting closer to Shabbos, they called the rabbi, and the rabbi told them the driver, who was not Jewish, could keep on driving them to the hotel, even though it was Shabbos. That's not our question of whether that was appropriate or not. It's not relevant to us. That was the Rav told them, that they could drive, they could be driven to the hotel. So when Shabbos started, where were they? They were on a highway someplace. Okay, that was their makom shvisa. And after they drove a bit, they ended up at the Techum. Okay, now, so let me just mention 2 things in quick, which is we're making an assumption that wherever they were when Shabbos started, that was their makom shvisa. So 2 things. First of all is the Mechaber says, the way the Mishnah explains it, is that what I said before about being over 10 tefachim doesn't apply to someone on a bus. The bus, my seat on the bus may be more than 10 tefachim off the ground, but the bus, everything, they're sitting on the ground, and therefore I'm considered to be on the ground. I'm not above 10 tefachim. That's one thing. And second, also, there's a bir halacha there. There's also in Sicily, there's also about it more specifically that a person's place, and the Mishnah wrote, the person's place can be designated a place even though they were in transit at the time. They weren't standing still. Okay, so their place was wherever they were when Shabbos started, and now they drove a few miles, and they finally get to the hotel, so they're out of the Techum. So, as I said beforehand, person walks out of his tchum, not allowed to walk that more than Daled Amas. And okay, so we say the bus is their Daled Amas, fine, they can walk all around the bus. But what about, but when the bus stops, they're not in an enclosed area. In our previous case, the person was in an airport, so we said the terminal is an enclosed area, he can walk around the whole terminal. But these boys are in an enclosed area, but then do they have to stay on the bus? Are they mechuyev to stay on the bus since that's where they were? They're out of the tchum, and the Rav told them they could drive till here. Fine, they're here. Now are they allowed to get off the bus and go into the building, into the hotel? So it's a really good example of a din that the Shulchan Aruch says, which is a person ended up out of the tchum through no fault of his own. He ended up out of the tchum. He gets Daled Amas, but he now, even so, there's an exception. He's allowed to walk out of his Daled Amas in order to get to a bathroom. It's not appropriate. It's not kavod habrios to tell the person he'll have to relieve himself in the middle of the street or wherever he is. And therefore, Chacham said is you can walk, even though a person who's out of the tchum can only walk Daled Amas. This person can walk more than Daled Amas to get to a bathroom, and then once he gets to the bathroom, he stays in that spot. So. Now, just before we move on, the Shulchan Aruch brings 2 days where when we say that a person's allowed to walk out of the bathroom. Okay, before we get to that part, the Mechaber talks about going to the bathroom. That's in Siman Tov Vav. 2 Siman before in Siman Tov Dalad. The Ramah says, it's not only if you have to go to the bathroom, it's also if you have to leave that spot because you're outdoors when you're out of your tchum, you're outdoors. And it was too rainy or too sunny for you to stay outside. So you see that this idea of this kavod habrios has to be as extreme as needing to go to the bathroom. It could even include some cases that are a little less extreme and not as strong kavod habrios. But I guess the point is a guy's sitting down and there's a storm and he's being soaked to the bone. So that's also kavod habrios to not require the guy just to stand there and get soaked for hours, and he's allowed to walk inside. Also considered kavod habrios. Okay, that's fine. So now, bearing that in mind, we now move to a place that the Mishabur talks about that the Mechaber has 2 days, and the Mishabur says that when it says you're allowed to walk inside to walk out of Daled Amas in order to get to the bathroom, that means that's only if you have to defecate. But if you have to just urinate, you're not allowed to. So I'm just thinking that nowadays, when nobody urinates in the street, then they used to, but nowadays nobody urinates in the street. Seemingly, urinating in the street is similar enough to a guy being soaked in the rain. In other words, the technicalities of going to the bathroom, of what the Shulchan Aruch says, might only include a person who has to defecate, but we would say is nowadays having to urinate is also good enough reason to go inside. Even it's also a kavod habrios enough to allow the person to walk out of his Daled Amas, just like if it's pouring rain and the guy's getting soaked. That's how we think. Okay, now, so the boys are allowed to get off the bus and walk Daled Amas more out of even though they're out of the tchum, they're only allowed to go Daled Amas. They're really only allowed to stay on the bus, but they're allowed to leave that in order to go to the bathroom. Now, what happens if they went out of 12 mil, which was not so unusual? I mean, 12 mil is only 8 miles, so the bus was stuck there in the snowstorm. Very reasonable that they would have walked 8 miles. I don't know in the real story, but I'm telling this from, I don't know if that's what happened, but that could have happened. So at first glance, you would say is, well, this that we say that mishum kavod habrios, you can be over an isser, typically it's understood that only means you can over an isser d'Rabbanan. Well, if I just said to you beforehand that 12 mil is a tchum d'oraisa, maybe you can't walk further out of your tchum just because of kavod habrios. So that's one way of looking at it. On the other hand, the Sha'ar Tzion says in Hilchos Yontiv that since many of the poskim hold that even 12 mil is only even a tchum of 12 mil is also only d'Rabbanan. It's also, he says in a Shas Tchak you could be soimech to allow a guy, in his case it was a guy, to bring food from out of the tchum even though it's out of 12 mil. So. And there's a real halacha by us who has similar types of wording for a different case. So it could be that now that case is to let a guy do something, which would be also, of course, is much more kal in here. But in our case, we have a kavod habrios issue also. So it could be that because of the kavod habrios, you would be samach on those most poskim who hold that even a tchum of 12 mil is also d'Rabbanan, and let them go to the bathroom. I don't know the answer to that question. But it's a fair question. Anyhow, so back to our boys over here. They're allowed to go mishum kavod habrios, go out of the bus and go into the hotel. And once they're inside, then once they went to the bathroom, they also get 4 amas. But as we keep saying, that 4 amas means the whole building. So therefore, they're allowed to walk any place in the building. So they should bear that in mind, which is now once they get that whole building, so they should think about which building they're going to go into. If they go into the gym that has a bathroom in it, that's the building they choose to go into, then they're going to be stuck in the gym the whole Shabbos because they won't have another excuse to go out for the bathroom. There's a bathroom there. So they should think smartly and say, which building do I want to go into? I'm allowed to go once. I'm allowed to go out of my home to get to a bathroom. Once I'm there, there'll be a bathroom there whenever I need it the whole Shabbos. So think about it and say, which building, once I get to that building, I can stay in that whole building. So think about which building you want to go into, that in order to be then be allowed to walk around the whole building. So you would think they would go to a building that has beds and food, etc., to go into. Now, I mentioned beforehand about whether an airport terminal is considered hookah for dira. That a question about that. A hotel is better than an airport terminal because although people just stay in a hotel for a short time, for a couple of days, but it's much more permanent that the person comes there, they stay there for a whole 24 hours or for 3 days in a row, and they eat there and they sleep there, much more serious, much more permanent, so to speak, or semi-permanent, much more than an airport or than a restaurant. So it's a better case to argue that this is considered hookah for deer. Okay, now our last case is about a delivery, and this is a case that has more Kashrus applications, if we could use that word. There was a family, the whole family, an extended family, got together for having Shabbos, Sheva brachas in a hotel, and the truck, the caterer's truck, being driven by a guy who was supposed to bring them their food, got stuck in traffic, and the food didn't arrive until an hour after Shabbos started. So there were many shilas about this, like how they can heat up their food and things like that. But one of the shilas was whether the food is usher. The food came from out of the Techum. So should the food, because the guy who's driving it, assuming this hotel is out of the Techum from where the guy was when Shabbos started, again, a reasonable possibility, then is the food usher because it came from out of the Techum? So there's two parts to the question, and one is a question: is it muktzah? There's an isser. One of the types of muktzah is muktzah machmas isser. You have to be over an isser to use this thing. So should we say that this food is muktzah machmas isser because the only way for me to get this food was to take it out of the Techum? I have to be over an isser in order to access this food or to use it. So you might think that, but it's not true. The Shulchan Aruch says in a few different places that just because food came from out of the Techum, that doesn't make it asur. That doesn't make it muktzah. It's not muktzah because of that. And the explanation, the Aruch HaShulchan, the Shartzin say is that because something can't be muktzah for one person and not muktzah for another person, which would be what was going on here. We would say it's not muktzah for whoever was in the Techum of that food when Shabbos started, and it would be yes muktzah for all the people who live further away. So it can't be that there's food that could be muktzah for me and not muktzah for you. It's muktzah for me because I was far away from it, and not muktzah for you because you were closer. There can't be such a thing. And there's a Rosh a Prima Gadol who says something similar to that also. There can't be such a it can't be food can't be muktzah for me and not for you. That's what the Mechaber says. There's two other shitas about whether food being muktzah, variations of this. One is what the Ramah says. I said the Prima Gadol. I'm sorry. It's the Prima Gadol like the Ramah. I'm sorry, not like the Mechaber. The Ramah says the food is muktzah unless the people who thought they were going to have access to this food. So it's not muktzah per se because you have to be over the issue, but muktzah because it's hoktzah midaitai. I didn't plan on using this food because it was out of the Techum. I wasn't having access to it. That's the only. It is muktzah unless it's muktzah unless you had in mind you were going to use it. And the Magen Avraham says a different way of saying that. He says it doesn't really depend on whether I had in mind. It all depends on the owner. Did the owner have in mind that he was gonna he was gonna be able to use this food on Shabbos or not? That's who it depends on whether they had in mind. Going to any of these, the Mechaber, the Ramah with the Prima Gadol, or the Magen Avraham, according to all of these opinions, in our case, the food is not muktzah because the people at the hotel are obviously hoping to get that food. They're planning on using this food. That the owners, the caterer, I don't know if the caterer is the owner or the people are the owner, but all of them are all counting on the fact that the food is going to make it here in time, is going to make it here, and so everyone has in mind to use this food. So and for sure, according to the Mechaber, so the food. So our first issue is the food muktzah? No, the food is not muktzah. Okay, but then there's a second thing, which is there's another din. The Mechaber says, which is that if food, a guy brings food from out of the Techum, the people who it was brought for are not allowed to use it. Okay, those people, this is not a muktzah issue. they're not allowed to eat the food because it was brought for them. Someone was over an Isser for them on Shabbos. So Shach understood that din about this food being brought from out of the Techum is not nothing. It's not a din that has anything to do with Techum. It's not if it came out of the Techum, there's an Isser for the people to eat. There's nothing special about Techumen. It's a general Isser, which is if a guy does malacha for me on Shabbos, I'm not allowed to have hana from it. It's a general rule that you can't have hana when a guy does malacha for you, or for, in this case, for the people at the Shavuot brachas, that you can't do that. So Shachta said penalties like this are only apply when the guy wasn't allowed to do what he did. But if the guy was allowed to do what he did, you can't say we're going to knas you that because the guy did malacha for you. Well, the guy was allowed to do that for you. It doesn't make sense to knas you then. Okay, and it's not. If it would be a special tchum din, maybe it would apply. But it's not a special tchum din. It's just a general rule that when a guy does malacha they wasn't supposed to, then they knas you and say you're not allowed to use it as a way of discouraging you from asking the guy. But over here, I think I mentioned, they asked the Shaila and were told that the guy was allowed to bring the food for them. If the guy was allowed to bring the food for them, he says then there's no reason to knas them, and the food would therefore, it wouldn't be usher for them to eat it, and as I mentioned, it wouldn't be muktzah, and therefore they could enjoy the food.